Camila Ramos from Edge and Node, the company behind the Graph. Really excited to share some insights around building smart contracts to actually present DAO insights. Cool. Welcome to the stage. Thank you, Cami. Take it away.
So just a little bit about me. I'm fairly new to the Web3 space. I kind of come from a more traditional background. I've been an educator for like 6 years. I've been teaching kids how to code in the Bay Area since 2016. I started an org that's now come to be known as STEM Tank, where we teach low-income students in the Bay Area how to code. Like I said, I went a more traditional path. I studied computer science in college, and I started my engineering career at PayPal on the checkout team. And most recently, I joined Edge and Node as a developer relations engineer. So the community that I manage and that I'm really familiar with is Women Build Web3. We're a fairly new community with the mission to bring more female non-binary engineering talent into the ecosystem. And we came together off of a tweet. It's actually a really good story. We came together trying to build teams for a hackathon, and we found that there was a lot of women who wanted to hack and who wanted to participate in the ecosystem, but didn't quite know how and didn't really know the steps or the tools that they needed to be successful in this space. So we got together 35 women who shipped a Web3 project for the first time at Web3Con, and then we grew to be Women Build Web3. And kind of one of the things that we're trying to figure out now is how to manage this community from the standpoint of how do we identify contributions that matter, how do we kind of rank and value those contributions, and then how do we use that to bring opportunities to members of the community. So one thing that we have kind of landed on is this product called Kudos. And I think actually the founder's running around here somewhere, but it's a company founded by a woman. It has like a female engineering team. And it's basically this on-chain record of your contributions that are quote-unquote soul-bound, meaning that you can't transfer them, and they're peer-to-peer. So kind of the problem that they're solving for is instead of having someone like a moderator or someone like a community manager having to manually track what everyone does and keep track of like, oh, who submitted a PR, who attended the meetings, who's actually voting, you can mint a Kudos for somebody and send it to them, and it'll be attached to their identity forever. And instead of kind of one person or a team being in charge of managing this, it's by your own peers. And you just fill out a form, you mint it for them, they don't have to pay any gas. And I put the form here just so you guys could see what kind of information you can include with this. But this is just kind of a starting point for us, and I think as communities develop and they identify what matters to them, they can build their own contracts for minting something similar to Kudos, where you either like you build your own or you kind of just like spin off of their contract. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. How can we build a contract to do something like mint Kudos, to expose the data that you want to track and get insights about later, to identify either who are your core contributors, who are people that are kind of meeting the standard to be called core team, or who's meeting some requirements to be eligible for certain things in your community. I'm a developer relations engineer at The Graph, and The Graph is an indexing and query protocol that makes it easy to read data from the blockchain. So without The Graph, right, you can read data from the blockchain, but you can kind of only read one piece at a time via the public methods of a smart contract, right? Like you can get the owner of a certain token, you can get the balance of a certain address, but if you want to do anything a little bit more sophisticated, anything having to do with like filtering and mapping relationships and identifying queries that are more than one piece of data at a time, you're going to want to use The Graph. And The Graph uses a query, the GraphQL query API, and you can literally build this in like 7 minutes. And if you're already familiar with The Graph, it's the exact same thing. So I'm going to talk about how we can use this to leverage The Graph in order to then be able to quickly identify some key people in your community instead of having to do it all manually. So when you deploy a smart contract, right, like the data that you as a developer might want to query for could be anywhere on the blockchain. And due to the nature and the structure of a blockchain, the data that you want could be living at different blocks. And there's really no built-in mechanism to identify and query for this data. So that's where The Graph comes in. And just a note here, I always try to make my content really beginner-friendly. So indexing is just kind of ordering your data to make a query very efficient. And now with The Graph, you can develop what's called a subgraph on any smart contract or contracts. And once you deploy them, anybody out there can use them as an API and use it to load data into their client. And then you as a community manager can either do this, and you don't necessarily have to hydrate some front end. You can just use this to get insights, or you could use it to build some sort of dashboard to track your community members. Now, the subgraph lives between your smart contracts and your UI, just like GraphQL would typically in kind of your Web 2 stack. And defining a subgraph, you just need to, as a developer, input a few things. You need to give it the data source. So what is the smart contract address or smart contracts? You can do more than one data source. The data that should be indexed. So for example, if I wanted to track a snapshot of who's actually voting, or if I wanted to track who's showing up to certain meetings, you define that. The events that you want to listen for, so the events in your contract that change the state of the thing that you're trying to track. So for example, if you have a token that maybe gets transferred, you want to be able to say, all right, when this token gets transferred, update this data so I can get the freshest copy of maybe who the owner is. And then finally, resolvers that are going to execute when these events are emitted. And the resolvers are the functions that apply the logic to construct and return an object defined in your GraphQL schema. And I just kind of put this up there so you guys can see you really only mess with 3 files as a developer, and you can get it up really fast. I was actually planning to try to live code it for you guys, but they didn't have the setup for that. So in the manifest, you define the start block of where you want to start indexing. You could omit this if you wanted to start indexing from the Genesis block. You define the entity names that you defined in your schema. So maybe it would be something like members, and then you define the properties, which maybe might be like their wallet address, their names, maybe the date they joined, things like that. And then finally, the events and the event handlers. So the events are those events that you want to listen for, and the event handlers are those functions that are going to execute your resolvers. And then in your schema file, here's where you actually define those objects, the properties that are available to query on them. And then your assembly script mappings are really similar to TypeScript if you've coded in TypeScript. And these are the actual resolvers that execute when something happens. So this is an example of an NFT project. It might be kind of hard to read for you guys, but it's basically going and grabbing the metadata from an IPFS hash and then constructing this object, getting certain attributes about this NFT collection. Here's where we're going to do the live coding. But luckily at the end, I have a QR code where you can see a full workshop for how to do this with step-by-step and pictures and all that. So if this sounds interesting, you can totally do this at home. Now, getting to the community insights part, you can do the same exact thing that we just talked about for an NFT project, but instead of having, maybe like your typical 721 token, you can design your own token and expose certain data that you want to be able to query for via events. So if you wanted to say, hey, when someone participates in a meeting, they get minted this Kudos or something like a Kudos, and in your event, you have to make sure that you're passing in certain things, which, for example, if you care about the date, you could pass in the date. If you wanted to know, how many minutes was this event, you could pass that in as part of your metadata. If you wanted to be able to query for, how consistent people are showing up to the meeting, you just have to make sure that you expose this in your events. And this is the standard that Mint Kudos uses, and I think it's something that we're going to look into using, because instead of having separate contracts for different tokens, you can just have one contract and have them all have different configurations and different metadata, so you can kind of create categories. Maybe you would have one token for the engineering guild, maybe you would have a token for the developer relations guild, for the community guild, to be able to identify people doing different types of work without having to deploy a bunch of contracts. And finally, this is the page I was talking about. The top QR code is a workshop on GitHub where it walks you through exactly how to develop a subgraph. And then below is a blog that kind of goes a little bit more in depth on what the graph is, what the graph does, and more technical on the mechanics of it. Finally, I would like to invite you guys to Graph Day. This is coming up the first week of June, and it's Graph Day followed by, let me get out of the way, followed by a 3-day hackathon in San Francisco at a really, really beautiful venue where a lot of kind of thought leaders and founders and CEOs are going to be speaking on their idea of the future of Web3. And thank you. Cool.